Well, natural resources class, this has certainly been an interesting couple of weeks. Coming to you from my basement, along with two dogs and two cats who seemed really interested in helping me make this recording. My original plan was to actually do video recording in our usual classroom, and I had worked towards that end, set up, got some pieces of equipment going, set up. Worked at getting some recordings done in another class, only to find out that we were not going to be allowed back on campus, and so things changed. So I'm afraid you're stuck listening to my voice. I know I can put my face down in the corner of this video, but I didn't think you really needed that. And listening to my voice, and I'm going to be going through a number of slides, images, as I do this, and I'm going to be assuming that you have the notes either copied off, sitting alongside of you so you can read them, or on your screen split, or whatever, and I'm going to go through them that way. I'm going to be using, putting some images, or looking at some images, like you can see on the screen right here, partially. This one you've seen before, and I won't have the notes on the screen after this first one. Just so you know, we'll just be looking at images, and I can move the cursor around to show you specific things on that, so hopefully this is okay. I know this is not optimal. There are some things I will not be able to do. I will not be able to show you the remainder of the Frontier House video series. I really regret that, because there are some aspects to that that strike at the heart of this class. But we'll just do the best we can, and be sure to use the forum for questions that are of a public nature. Really like to see that. So here we go. So what I'm going to do today is a little bit redundant. The last class we had before break, I had about 65% attendance. So that's certainly, a nice number of you that were there. So I'm going to go over just a few items and then finish up the forestry part of things. The next video will be the beginning of agriculture. And so there will be a little bit of redundancy here. So actually, I'm not going to go over everything, but I'm going to start off with this last piece. If you do have decision-making capability or requirements over some forestry, some forest, and you decide to harvest some wood for whatever reason, because you want some money to pay taxes, because there is insect or storm damage, or as I'm trying to convince you, there's just sound scientific reasons to manage a forest, part of which is harvesting at some point. There are options available to you. In class, I played you some video clips, one of a news piece. I think it was a Channel 4, Channel 5 News. I don't have permission to put that on Moodle, but the essence of it was just getting you to notice the terminology that the people were using, how they're using this term clear-cut, just to sort of get a rise out of people. It's so vilified, it's so negatively portrayed in our world today that it's used that way. In fact, as I mentioned, I've gone to forestry conferences where we've been encouraged to use other terms, such as coppice forest management, instead of clear cut, to make it more palatable to people that we're trying to convince that it's a good management option for them. So anyway, here's the rest of the story, if you will. So on this image that I've showed you before, the point is this is obviously a clear cut. There's nothing left standing, just stumps. In this field, and so if one looks at that, you're left with the impression that this is all that's left after the logging is done, nothing but a field of stumps and grass, and that's can leave one with the impression that that's the way it's to be forever and ever, amen, sort of thing. But that's not the case. Clear cutting, however, is well, I get you to say traumatic to the forest. I don't think very many people that would look at this picture that you see right here and say, boy, that's really an attractive look. And maybe some, I don't know. That's kind of a relative thing. This looks like a clear cut. It looks like a Pacific West Coast clear cut. Doesn't look like anything around here. But clearly there's been some dramatic action taken there. And as we specified in class, if you do a clear cut after the fact, some of the negative consequences of a clear cut are things like wind throw, this sort of a look. If we go back to this previous image, if you look at the trees on the edge, if there was a wind, a strong wind coming out of the screen at you, these trees on the edge of the clear cut would be subject to being blown over by that strong wind. We would call that wind throw. And it would look like this. Also, when you remove so much vegetation, you put that area at risk for erosion, like we see here on this logging road. After a good rain, there's obviously going to be some ruts created, some sediment carried away. Those are definitely negative aspects of clear cutting. So why would people ever do it? Why would people ever do a thing like that? Well, there are very sound scientific forest management reasons to do that. One, it's a good way to regenerate pioneering tree species that don't do well in competition. For instance, in this part of the world, that might be something like this. This is an aspen stand. We would call it popple. Industry would call it popple. This is almost pure aspen. It's not white birch. There's really very little else growing in this stand, and it's almost so bright it hurts the eyes to look at. This is, of course, too dense. This tree right here that I'm tracing with the cursor, and this one right here already have a disease. This is called hypoxylon canker. It's killing that tree off. It's killing that tree off. These will self-thin as they mature and develop a density that they can sustain. But aspen really does regenerate a forest rapidly around here, and it grows rapidly. Rotation rate of about 50 years. Another type of a species that does well in that type of setting is jack pine. This is a regenerating jack pine stand. It's been planted. You can maybe make out the idea of some rows in the background here. And jack pine, you can see this is 1 year's growth right here. I've seen 2 and 3 feet of growth on a jack pine tree in 1 year. So they can grow rapidly and reforest an area. But they don't do well if there's a lot of competition from bigger trees around. And so they do best if you slick the area off, cut everything down. The requirement is usually to cut every stem 1 inch and bigger down. There are some species that are adapted to this type of an environment. If we look at some examples, here's some examples of birds that are adapted to a clear-cut jack pine, regenerating jack pine, golden wing warbler, and then this bottom one is a Kirtland's warbler. It actually requires young jack pine. It's actually an endangered species. Part of the reason it's endangered is because there's not that much habitat for it. We've done such a good job of eliminating forest fire that you don't see much regenerating jack pine. You do after a clear cut. So those would be some reasons to do a clear cut. On your notes here, you can see it's a very easy way to do it. Very, very easy to cut everything down. It's also good for wildlife. If you're a grouse hunter or deer hunter, this type of a setting, woodcock love this. It's wonderful for those types of animals too. But that's not your only option. There is also a selective cut. And by a selective cut, I mean something, sorry, got to back up just a little bit here. Got ahead of myself a little bit. So this is actually some examples of a clear cut. You don't have to replant after a clear cut. Certainly you can. And some examples of what that might look like. So right here, after a clear cut, here's a bulldozer pushing the slash into a pile. And here the bulldozer is cutting a furrow and to replant, and probably the slash has been burned in this case. Here you have some people planting trees, and here's one young lady that's going along, and she's carrying satchels of seedlings, stomping them in the ground, and that's certainly the way you can regenerate a forest after a clear cut. But you don't have to do that. In this part of the country, a lot of areas you can just leave them be. Here's an example. Here is an area that was clear cut April 12th, 2012. These stems, most of these stems that are remaining out here are dead trees, but I just wanted to scroll down through this. And here is that same stand in October of the same year. These are all young aspen trees that have sprouted and grown in that one growing year without being planted. Here again is that same stand. Now this is a year, this is September of the next year. Here is that stump, and you can see the abilities, the capabilities of these trees to grow rapidly, reforest that area rapidly. Here is 2 years later, and here's that stump. Look at the height of some of these trees that have grown back in just 2 years, 2 or 3 years. And then I'll jump ahead to 2018. This is the most recent picture I have. Here is that stump down here, and now some of these trees are like 15 feet tall. So nothing was done to plant that forest, but you can replant a forest. Here's what a West Coast forest looks like after 34 years. So actually, that's not exactly what I wanted. I wanted to go back to, nope. Sorry folks, got to get it on the first slide. That one. Okay, now slideshow. Okay, this is in 1940, and that's obviously been clear cut. 1945, 5 years later, it's been replanted. Looks like that. 1950, again, significantly different. 1955, 15 years later, that forest is really coming on. 1961, the trees are starting to dwarf the houses, the logging shanties that are there. Here's 1971, you can barely see the shanties down in the middle center of the frame. And here's 1974, 34 years, and that has come back fairly dramatically from a clear cut. So again, just to go back, that is what it looked like 34 years later. That is what it looks like initially. So just seeing a clear cut is not the way that that area stays forever and ever. Okay, so the other option would be a selective cut. And there are many forms of selective cuts. Oops, that's not the one I wanted. If I go back to this image, and I'm going to scroll up to an area that I'm familiar with in northern Wisconsin. I showed the class this. Here's an area of northern hardwood forest. It's a mix of maple, basswood, trees of that sort. This is what it looked like after it had been thinned. If you look right down the property line, this is the property line right here. This is the unthinned stand. This is the thinned stand. And so you can see there's still a forest. This is summertime looking from the other direction. Thinned on this side, unthinned on this side. There's certainly still a forest left. This is some other area out in the thinned area, what it looks like in sort of early spring. You can see the stumps and some of the slash, but certainly there's a forest left there. So selective cut doesn't mean that you have to lose your forest. And you can have a number of options available to you. For instance, if we look, here's another type of a selective cut. In this case, it's a red oak stand that has been thinned, and this is going to enable regeneration to be established, young red oaks to grow down here because they like the amount of sunlight that you see there. Or here, this one is called a seed tree method. This is, again, white pines left to leave it as a seed source. These are all options available to a manager to harvest some wood, but to leave a forest standing. Okay, wanted to just consider then finally a couple of ways to regenerate a forest. And I think I'm going to stop right there and just give you a short other video of this regeneration and sort of pick it up from there. It'll probably just be 10 minutes or so. So I'm going to stop with this recording and another one coming soon.